I used to be the biggest skeptic in my family. I thought people who blamed their misfortunes on curses, shadows, or dark magic were just looking for an excuse, grasping at supernatural explanations for mundane problems. I believed in logic, in science, in the tangible world. But then it happened to me, and I learned a terrifying truth. Sometimes the darkness is real, and it wears a familiar face. It began shortly after my engagement. I was living in my childhood bedroom, a spacious room with a large bay window overlooking the backyard. My older brother had recently built a series of large wire aviaries out back, intending to keep parrots and peacocks. But at the time, they stood completely empty, casting long, skeletal shadows in the moonlight. It was well past midnight. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, struggling to fall asleep, when I saw it. A silhouette. A tall, motionless figure standing just outside the glass of my window, partially obscured by the empty cages. My heart slammed against my ribs. I screamed, thrashing in my blankets, yelling for my brother. He came running with a heavy flashlight, sweeping the beam across the yard, checking behind the sheds, inspecting the cages. Nothing. Just the wind rustling through the trees. He told me it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the moon. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But the nights that followed were a slow descent into madness. I would wake up with a paralyzing sensation that someone was standing right beside my bed. Sometimes I could feel the mattress dip, as if an invisible weight had sat down on the edge. I would freeze, too terrified to open my eyes, waiting for a touch that never came, only to bolt upright and turn on the lamp to an empty room. Then came the night that broke me. It was around 1 a.m. I was tossing and turning, my phone glowing in the dark. My infant niece, Chloe, had recently started using a baby walker, and she often wore tiny silver bangles on her wrists that jingled with her movements. Out of the darkness, I heard it. Chun, chun. The distinct, rhythmic jingling of metal bracelets, accompanied by the squeak of rubber wheels on hardwood. My mind rationalized it immediately. My brother must have brought Chloe into my room to play while I was awake. But when I turned my head, my blood turned to ice. The baby walker wasn't across the room. It was parked mere inches from my pillow. I scrambled backwards, a scream tearing from my throat. And I didn't sleep in that room again. I moved into my mother's room, sleeping on the floor beside her bed like a frightened child. Around this time, my engagement to David began to unravel in the most bizarre, catastrophic ways. David was a hard-working, stable man, but suddenly his life was a series of unexplainable disasters. He would secure a promising job only for the company to fold or for him to be falsely accused of misconduct within weeks. Projects he managed were plagued by theft, fraud, or sudden, inexplicable failures. The stress bled into our relationship. Arguments erupted over nothing. The tension in our families became suffocating. Eventually, exhausted and broken, my parents advised me to end it. They said a man who couldn't hold on to his life couldn't be trusted to build one with me. Heartbroken and mentally drained, I agreed. We called off the wedding. But the true horror didn't reveal itself until weeks later, when we were packing up my room to move to a new apartment. My mother was stripping the bed, shaking out the pillows, when something heavy and stiff fell out of the pillowcase and hit the floor with a dull thud. It was a bundle of tightly folded aged parchment, bound with black thread. My mother's hands trembled as she unfolded it. They were cursed charms. Crude, dark symbols were drawn in what looked like dried, rusted ink. But it was the names written beneath them that made the room spin. My name. My mother's name, David's name, and his mother's name. We stood in stunned, horrified silence. Someone had planted these in my bed. Someone had been actively working to destroy my mind, my relationship, and my future. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The self-harm I had been experiencing, the sudden blinding headaches that made me want to smash my head against the wall, the deep, unexplained scratches on my arms, the overwhelming urge to hurt myself, wasn't depression. It was an assault, a targeted, malicious attack from someone who wanted me broken. The paranoia set in deep. I felt a cold, heavy shadow trailing me everywhere I went. A few weeks later, I was sitting in the back of my mother's car, waiting while my mother and my aunt chatted outside. My niece Chloe was asleep in the car seat beside me. I glanced toward the far corner of the back seat, and my breath hitched. Huddled in the shadows was a figure, a woman or something shaped like a woman, entirely cloaked in darkness. I couldn't make out a face, only a suffocating, dense void that seemed to absorb the light around it. The sheer primal terror of it triggered a panic attack so severe I couldn't speak. I screamed for my mother, clawing at the door handle, but by the time she ripped the door open and looked inside, the corner was empty. I was left shaking, drenched in cold sweat, unable to explain what I had seen without sounding completely insane. I tried to cling to normalcy. I bought a new thick winter shawl, even showing it off to my aunt earlier that day. I left it folded neatly on the living room sofa, planning to wear it to my university classes the next morning. But when I went to retrieve it, I stopped dead in my tracks. The shawl had been shredded. Dozens of precise, deliberate cuts sliced through the fabric, as if someone had taken a pair of heavy shears and methodically destroyed it in the dead of night. When I asked my family, they brushed it off, suggesting I must have bought it damaged, but I knew better. The supernatural intrusions became my new normal. Food would vanish from the refrigerator, objects would slide off shelves and shatter on the floor for no reason. I always loved teddy bears. I kept 3 large ones on my bed, but soon my dreams were invaded by them. In my sleep, I would see the bears standing over me, their button eyes gleaming with malice, their stuffed paws wrapping around my throat, squeezing the life out of me. I would wake up gasping, clawing at my own neck, convinced I was being strangled. My mental state deteriorated rapidly. I withdrew from my friends. I developed a seething, irrational hatred for everyone around me. If someone spoke to me, my first instinct was violent rage. I began waking up in the middle of the night, fully dressed in bright red clothing, my lips smeared with dark lipstick, wandering the dark hallways of the house like a ghost. My family, desperate to find a silver lining, convinced themselves it was just pre-wedding jitters, the eccentric behavior of a stressed bride-to-be. They didn't see the monster I was becoming. They didn't see the entity pulling my strings. The climax of this torment occurred at my university. I was sitting in a lecture hall when a sudden, violent gush of blood erupted from my nose. It wasn't a trickle, it was a flood. Within seconds, my shirt was soaked in crimson, dripping on the floor. My classmates panicked. I was rushed to the campus hospital where doctors ran a battery of urgent tests. The results? Perfectly normal. No clotting disorders, no high blood pressure, no underlying conditions. Medically, I was fine. But spiritually, I was drowning. I found myself drawn to the dark, isolated corners of the campus, seeking out the dense groves of trees at the edge of the property, sitting in the shadows for hours, finding comfort only in the absence of light. Then came the day my parents officially and formally terminated the engagement with David's family. I remember the exact moment the phone call ended. A massive, invisible weight lifted from my chest. The crushing pressure in my skull vanished. For the first time in months, I felt a profound, euphoric sense of peace. I was genuinely, radiantly happy. My mother looked at me, bewildered by my sudden joy, assuming I was just relieved the constant fighting was over. But I knew the truth. The source of the misery was gone. The curse had lost its anchor. However, the darkness wasn't done with me yet. When my family began arranging a new marriage for me with a wonderful, kind man, the obstacles were immediate and bizarre. On the day of our formal blessing ceremony, my future mother-in-law suddenly collapsed with a severe, unexplained illness. When we finally managed to set a firm wedding date, a sudden, tragic death occurred in the groom's family that very same day, throwing everything into chaos and sparking bitter arguments between the households. It felt as though an invisible hand was actively sabotaging any chance I had at happiness. It was during this darkest period that a wise, elderly neighbor pulled me aside. She didn't offer charms or rituals. She simply looked at me with deep, sorrowful eyes and said, You need to reclaim your own spirit. Start praying. Find your faith. Speak to the light, because the dark is listening. For the first time in my life, I took it seriously. I began to pray quietly every day. I read passages of Scripture, not out of obligation, but as a shield. I actively sought out positivity, forcing myself to step away from the negative energy that had consumed me. Slowly, agonizingly, the fog began to lift. The nightmares faded. The self-harm stopped. I began to heal. But there is one chilling detail I have never forgotten, a truth that keeps me awake at night. I know exactly who orchestrated this nightmare. I know who planted those cursed parchments in my pillow. It was a close family member, someone I trusted implicitly, someone whose homemade rice pudding I absolutely loved, who would always pull me into the kitchen with a warm smile, insisting I taste it first, feeding me with her own hands. We don't visit her house anymore. We don't speak to her, but sometimes when I'm alone in the quiet of my home, I can still smell the faint, sweet scent of that pudding, and I am reminded of the terrifying reality that the most dangerous monsters don't hide under the bed. They sit at the dinner table, smiling as they feed you poison. The next morning, the house descended into absolute chaos. It started subtly. A heavy, smooth river stone sailed through the kitchen window, shattering the glass and embedding itself in the drywall. No one was outside. No car drove away. It was as if the forest itself had thrown it. Then the clothes. My aunt was doing laundry, and suddenly the wet garments began to flying through the air, swirling around the living room in an invisible, violent cyclone. Panic consumed the house. My aunt, terrified and desperate, took Sarah and drove 2 hours to a remote town to see a spiritual healer, a man known in the area for dealing with things the police wouldn't touch. When they returned, the healer's face was ashen. He sat my aunt down and delivered a verdict that made the blood run cold. Your house has been targeted by a highly sophisticated, deeply malicious curse, he said, his voice trembling. There are 2 entities attached to this property, witches. They have been sent here with a specific, deadly purpose. He looked around the room, his eyes dark. They want a death in this family. They want to spill blood so that your family's name will be ruined, so that the police will investigate and find nothing but madness. If you hadn't locked that bathroom door last night, the pipe would have killed Rachel. And if the pipe failed, the next attack would have been with scissors. They will not stop until someone is dead. The healer explained that the person who cast this curse had performed a gruesome ritual. They had buried a bundle of cursed talismans inside the hollowed-out skull of a goat, burying it deep in the earth, and had offered the lives of several black goats to the dark entities in exchange for our destruction. He gave my aunt a bottle of water, heavily blessed and prayed over. Sprinkle this in every corner of the house, on every threshold and on every window. This will bind them. It will force them into silence for 40 days. But if the 40 days pass and the rituals aren't fully broken, the entities will return, and the cleansing will take months, maybe years. We spent the rest of the day sprinkling the water, reciting prayers, and burning sage until the house choked on the thick white smoke. For the next 40 days, the house was dead silent. No stones, no flying objects, no footsteps. But the damage was done. The trust in our family was fractured. Who had done this? Who hated us deeply enough to slaughter animals and desecrate the dead just to see us destroyed? We never found out. The 40 days passed, the house remained quiet, but the shadow of that night never truly left. Every time it rains, I still check the corners of the room, terrified of what might be standing in the dark. I was 18 when the nightmare started, and I'm 22 now, but the things I saw with my own eyes in that house still crawl into my mind when the lights go out. We were a tight-knit family, Just my parents, my two older brothers, David and Michael, and my two older sisters who had already married and moved out. The house was always loud, always full of life. That was until the weddings began. My parents started looking for matches for David and Michael. After months of searching, they found two sisters, Sarah and Emily, from a distant branch of our family. A few older relatives pulled my parents aside and warned them, "Don't put two sisters in the same house," they said. "It breeds jealousy, and it will tear the family apart." But my parents laughed it off. They thought it was just an old wives' tale. The double wedding was held in late October. 4 months later, David and Michael brought their new wives home to live with us. The first few weeks were a blur of happiness and laughter, but then a slow, toxic rot began to spread through the house. It started with David. He completely lost interest in his wife, Sarah. He would come home from work and avoid her, barely speaking a word. When my mom tried to intervene, asking what was wrong, David just shrugged. "We don't click," he said coldly. "I can't stand her habits." It was true they were very different. David was polished, ambitious, and refined, while Sarah was very rustic, unrefined, and lacked social grace. But it was more than just a personality clash. Sarah became intensely, obsessively possessive. She couldn't stand David talking to anyone else, not even his own mother. The tension finally snapped one evening when Sarah launched into a vicious, screaming tirade against my mom, saying things so cruel and unforgivable that the entire house went dead silent. 4 months after moving in, David filed for divorce. Sarah packed her bags and left. But Emily, the younger sister, stayed. Before the divorce, Emily had been quiet, polite, and sensible. But after her sister was forced out, something inside her fractured. She didn't leave with Sarah. Instead, she stayed in the house, married to my younger brother, Michael. But she changed. A dark, brooding silence fell over her. She would sit in the corners of rooms for hours, staring at nothing, carrying herself like someone who knew a terrible secret but refused to share it. 2 years passed in this heavy, suffocating atmosphere. David remained single, throwing himself into his work. Then he met Jessica. She was a brilliant, beautiful doctor, sharp-witted and kind. She was everything Sarah wasn't. David was completely in love, and her family was wonderful. We all breathed a sigh of relief. Finally, the house would heal. They got married and moved into the guest wing of our large home. For exactly 1 month, we had peace. Then, the darkness returned. It started with a whisper. Jessica woke up in the middle of the night and told David that someone had been knocking on their bedroom door, softly calling her name. She said the voice sounded exactly like Sarah. David was confused because he'd been lying right next to her the entire time. We brushed it off as a stress-induced nightmare. But then the house turned against them. Bitter, explosive fights erupted between David and Jessica over the most trivial things: a misplaced set of keys, a slightly cold cup of coffee. It would spiral into hours of screaming matches. Jessica's health began to fail. She was constantly exhausted, plagued by unexplainable migraines. The doctors ran every test imaginable, but her blood work was perfect. Yet she kept telling us, "I feel like someone is standing in the corner of the room watching me. Every time I close my eyes, I can feel her breathing on my neck." Then came the night that broke my reality. It was around 2 a.m. I woke up thirsty and padded downstairs to the kitchen. The house was pitch black, save for the pale, rectangular glow of the open refrigerator door. As I rounded the corner, I froze. Emily was standing in the middle of the kitchen. She was completely motionless, rigid as a mannequin, staring blankly at the open fridge. The pale light washed over her face, making her look like a corpse. "Emily?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Slowly, mechanically, she turned her head to look at me, and then she smiled. But it wasn't a human smile. her lips stretched impossibly wide, pulling back to expose her gums in a grotesque, ear-to-ear grin. Her eyes were dead, hollow, and locked on mine. A wave of pure, primal terror washed over me. I didn't say another word. I turned and sprinted back to my room, locking the door behind me, my heart hammering against my ribs. The next morning, the house was bright and normal. I found Emily in the living room, sipping coffee, looking perfectly cheerful. I asked her if she had come down to the kitchen last night. She looked at me with genuine confusion. "No," she said lightly. "I was asleep in my room all night. Why?" I never told anyone what I saw. I thought I just caught her sleepwalking, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me in the dark. But I was wrong. Soon after that, the financial foundation of our family business began to crumble. Unexplained losses, sudden audits, missing funds. The house itself felt infected. Objects would slide off the counters and shatter. Heavy footsteps would echo in the empty hallways at 3 a.m. And sometimes, drifting up from the basement, we would hear the faint, muffled sound of a woman laughing. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon. Jessica was sitting in the living room when she suddenly let out a blood-curdling scream and collapsed to the floor. We rushed to her side, but she was thrashing violently, her eyes rolled back in her head. When she finally gasped for air and opened her eyes, they were wide with absolute, unadulterated horror. "Get her out!" Jessica shrieked, clawing at her own face. "Her! She's going to kill me!" My dad dropped to his knees, grabbing her shoulders. "Jessica, who is going to kill you?" "Her!" Jessica sobbed, pointing a trembling finger at the empty hallway. "Her! She's standing right there!" And then she passed out cold. We lived in that suffocating terror for 6 months. Jessica was a shell of herself, terrified to leave her bedroom. David was losing his mind. Finally, my dad reached out to a seasoned spiritual counselor, a man who specialized in deliverance and paranormal cleansing. He was an older, hardened man who had seen the darkest corners of the supernatural world. When he arrived, he didn't say a word. He just walked through the house, his face growing darker with every step. Finally, he stopped in front of Emily's bedroom. He walked in, knelt down, and reached his hand deep under her bed. When he pulled his hand out, he was holding a dirty, tightly bound cloth bundle. He untied it on the kitchen table while we all watched in horrified silence. Inside were locks of human hair, small vials of dried, blackened blood, and pieces of parchment covered with jagged occult symbols. The counselor looked up, his eyes grim. "This is deep, malicious, dark magic," he said, his voice echoing in the silent kitchen. "The woman who was driven out of this house has returned. She isn't here in the flesh, but her spirit has been anchored here to destroy this family from the inside out." The counselor didn't just leave us with a warning. He initiated a grueling multi-night cleansing ritual. Every evening as the sun dipped below the horizon, the atmosphere in the house grew suffocatingly heavy. We burned thick bundles of sage and recited ancient protective verses in every room, sealing the thresholds with holy water. But the darkness fought back. As the prayers grew louder, Emily's reactions became increasingly violent. She would be thrown across the bed, her body contorting in unnatural ways. She would scream until her vocal cords tore, then suddenly break into that same hollow, echoing laughter we had heard in the halls. Sometimes she would speak in a raspy, guttural voice that belonged to an old man or a weeping child. It was a psychological torture that left us all exhausted, paranoid, and terrified. The breaking point arrived on a suffocatingly humid Tuesday night. Without warning, the local power grid failed. The house was plunged into an absolute, pitch-black void. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of our own ragged breathing. Then we heard it. Creak, creak. Footsteps. Someone was slowly descending the grand wooden staircase in the central hallway. I was standing in the living room, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. My hands shook violently as I grabbed a heavy metal flashlight from the kitchen drawer. I clicked it on, the bright beam cutting through the darkness, and swept it toward the staircase. My blood turned to ice. Halfway down the stairs stood a woman. She was draped in a tattered, flowing white gown that looked like it had been buried in the damp earth. Her long, matted hair hung down, completely obscuring her face. But the most horrifying detail wasn't her dress. It was her neck. Her head was twisted completely backward, her face pointing directly at the ceiling. As the beam of light hit her, the entity slowly raised its hands and let out a wet, rattling laugh that seemed to vibrate in my very teeth. Before I could even scream, the flashlight flickered, and she was gone. The stairs were empty. The sheer terror of that night broke whatever denial my family had left. The cleansing rituals intensified, shifting from defensive prayers to an aggressive, relentless purging of the house. Slowly, agonizingly, the heavy, oppressive cloud that had suffocated our home began to lift. The vicious arguments between David and Jessica stopped. Jessica's health returned, the color coming back to her cheeks. The unexplained financial losses ceased, and the house finally felt like a home again. But the spiritual counselor had left us with one final chilling condition. The entity was bound to the house through a living anchor. As long as Emily remained under this roof, the doorway would never truly close. The darkness would always have a foothold. My younger brother Michael was stubbornly blinded by love and denial. He refused to accept that his wife was the conduit of the nightmare that had nearly destroyed us. He packed his bags, took Emily, and moved out to a rental house on the other side of town. We made a collective, unspoken decision as a family. The ties were severed. We never spoke to Emily again. We never visited her. We completely cut her out of our lives to protect ourselves. Today, the house is quiet. The laughter in the halls has stopped, and the shadows in the corners are just shadows. David and Jessica are happy, and the family has finally healed. But the scars of those years run deep. Sometimes, when I'm walking down the hallway at night, I still catch a faint, sweet scent of decay in the air. I still hear the faintest echo of a raspy laugh. I know we survived it, but I also know the truth. You can banish the monsters from your house, but you can never truly unsee them. And in the dead of night, when the house is perfectly silent, I always wonder if she's still out there, waiting for the door to open again.